representing the LGBTIQ plus staff. I welcome you, Nanoo, to our conversation. And I'm joined by Katyayani, and the two of us shall be moderating today's session. Welcome.
Thank you very much. It's a big pleasure to be here, Prabhashini and Katyayani. My name is Gurchaten, I'm better known as Nanoo. My pronouns are they, he. Indeed, I am the president of UN Globe, which is the LGBTI group, which is a group that represents LGBTIQ plus personnel. Just a little bit about myself as way of introduction. As you can tell from my accent, I'm a British-born Sikh person, a queer person belonging to my parents are migrant workers from Punjab, India. I myself am a migrant worker. I work in Geneva, Switzerland, keeping the tradition of migration going, although, there's different privileges afforded to me as a migrant, but vis-a-vis to the migratory status of my parents back in the 70s in the UK. As well as being the president of UN Globe, I'm also a program officer working on non-discrimination and equal pay for work and value. Very fortunate that both of my roles, my official duties in the UN, in the International Labour Organization, as well as my advocacy work within the UN spaces, is somewhat similar and interlinked, and I have that sort of joy of and commitment as well to be able to do both parts, both internal and external. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm so fascinated by the work you're doing. I think it's an important conversation that needs to be had, and not enough, especially in spaces of where in South Asian, Southeast Asian cultures as well, especially, and also diaspora communities where we still hold on to strong cultural values, and if not more so than our countries of origin, our home communities. So yeah, looking forward to this conversation. I know I'm looking forward to getting uncomfortable and being challenged and learning from you all, because I think definitely we have a space to learn. Just as a bit of an introduction, also this is a safe space for those who want to share. Please do share, but also share if there's any incidences of violence and harassment. Please do indicate that there's a trigger warning. I know it's cultural, especially in India or in parts of our South Asia community, to say sir. It's okay, just call me Nanoo. I prefer that. So so looking forward to this conversation with you both.
Thank you so much. In fact, Katyayani had prepared a really nice intro for you. So, Katyayani,
good afternoon, everyone.
Go ahead with
Hi, Nanoo. I think, with somebody whose body of work is so engaging and interesting as yours, preparing an introduction and actually speaking it is both an easy and difficult task. I think easy because, there's so much one can talk about, but tough because one always feels, is one doing justice to all that you have done and, the persona you are. So we're really looking forward to, hearing you today. Just, for our, all the people out here, I'll still, give a bit of a formal introduction. Gurchaten Sandhu. So basically, Nanoo goes by the pronouns he and they, as he just mentioned, is the president for UN Globe, the group representing the LGBTIQ plus staff in the UN system, and the Non-Discrimination Program Officer at the ILO's Fundamental Principles and Rights at Work branch. As its president, they work to ensure the voice and rights of the LGBTIQ plus staff are represented in the UN policies and procedures. They also serve as the committee member of International Family Equality Day NGO, a fellow of the Salzburg Global LGBT Forum, a Sarbat LGBT6 volunteer, and a board advisor for We Create Space. They are listed as the Outstanding Executive LGBT Role Model for 3 consecutive years from 2018 to 20, and honoree of the Out in Equals 2021 Global LGBTQ Corporate Advocate Outie Award, as well as the winner of the British LGBTQ Award for Exceptional Inclusion 2021.
So in Viram today, we're essentially trying to sort of shift our gaze, from hidden and symbolic-based gender violence, which is supported and normalized by institutions and normative frameworks, And in this, we often regard gender as a spectrum, essentially. So in today's session, what we're really aiming to do is we challenge the dominant narrative of who the abused survivor is. Usually female, probably under 40, typically thin and always straight. We're trying to do something else here. So this narrative holds a surprising amount of power as it impacts our legislation, how we build programming and how we spend money, and our social sympathies towards survivors most. So this narrative, while we feel is very real and important, it is still incomplete as it does not represent the experiences and stories of many significant others. Hence, Viram. So Viram is a term which essentially means to pause, where you kind of step back. You take a step further back because maybe the problem begins before the narrative is reinforced to the exclusion of the LGBTIQ community. Maybe the problem begins before the narrative is written. Maybe it is written in a different language, a language that doesn't necessarily translate to the queer communities of color, or anyone who share a marginalized identity. So I just give a thought experiment to all my members and friends of Viram. Remember how you scramble during an emergency to communicate to a person who doesn't know your language, something that you want. Just try and think about such a situation. That's what maybe a queer survivor of abuse faces when confronting systems, institutions, and people who do not speak their language. So today we will be listening to a story unique and complex and punctuated by resilience. So I think developing that kind of a framework towards multiple stories, towards counter narratives, towards counter stories is something that we're trying to do here in Viram. So it's essentially a discursive protest before really looking at before really coming up with an intervention program. What we're really trying to do here is challenge certain, ideas that are handed down very effortlessly and which are internalized equally effortlessly for that matter. Katyayani, go ahead.
Yes, so taking off from where what Priya said, so Nanoo will be heading today's discussion. The format we'll be following is talking about a few things and a few aspects and issues we would like to talk about, particularly relating to IPV, but touching upon gender violence, non-violent violence, non-gendered violence, everything as a spectrum. And it's a privilege for us that Nanoo has reposed his trust on our platform, through which they will be sharing their own personal reflections and experiences of psycho-emotional abuse and harassment from queer perspectives. As Priya mentioned, Nanoo, ours is also a forum for healing, and one of our intents in putting out these stories amongst each other is to foster a forum where we can all talk about it and move on from individual healing to collective healing.
And I just want to put out a trigger warning for our viewers. This is something that Nanoo mentioned. So we will be discussing potential topics around abuse and especially in relation to sexuality. So this is a safe space. If any of you need to turn off your headphones, let's say leave the session, switch off your cameras, please feel free to do so. You could also log out and log in maybe with your pseudonyms and pronouns that you're comfortable with. And at any point you're uncomfortable or have something to say, please reach out to the moderators on the chat box. That's myself and Katyayani. Please also know that if your pronouns and gender that you identify as changes at any time, you can let us know and we will make sure that it is respected. And you may please post your questions on the chat box. So yes, we'll give it up to you now, Nanoo. Let's have you over. It's such a wonderful experience, honestly, to have you here. Please go ahead.
No, thank you very much, and my apologies for the introduction in advance. And thank you for the beautiful introduction and the add-on. I'm really honoured, and I think I think one of the key things is that how one of the I think when we're talking about such an important topic as well, and we're very mindful of, and even reflecting on this now at this very moment, is how do I give up power, and how do I command respect and equality at the same time, and how do we do that, especially in communities where humility is very important. I mean, when we were doing the introductions, I heard words like only. I think we need to change the narrative about when we're talking about ourselves. I'm only. How do we get the balance right between humility and subordination or respect as well? How do we get that right, especially in a cultural setting as such as the one I share with most of you and maybe many of the listeners, where we have a cultural value of hierarchy, of patriarchy as well. But how do we how do we break those structures down, but ensure that we still have respect for one another, respect for our community elders, respect for our siblings, respect for younger people as well? Because I think that's a key thing there. We want to get rid of those that patriarchy. But I think the first question, I think the one that you posed to me was around. Should we go into the questions that you want?
Yes. I think we could do that too. Katyayani, go ahead.
Yes, Nanoo. So, one thing which I always wanted to talk about, when we decided, and when actually, you were gracious enough to engage us in a conversation today, was something that's to how our collective actually started. When we look at intimate partner violence, also something which we refer to as intimate terrorism. So, when we talk about it, there's always a power differential that we talk about. One partner holding power over the other person's choices, about their spaces, about their life patterns, about their thoughts. So that is the power equation we always refer to, which makes one partner vulnerable to be emotionally, sexually, mentally harassed or abused by the other partner. So that's something that always intrigues me, in a heteronormative society, especially talking about a society like India. We always assume the male to have that power over the female. Because, when we talk about in terms of sexes are purely biological, as we all understand. But as soon as we move on to gender, we always impose the burden of society as well as a platform a social recognition gives us. So, when we talk about that gender differential, that power differential creeps in automatically. But when we talk about same gender relationships or the relationships in the queer community, how does this power differential play out? And where does gender fall in? I mean, how is gender actually important in understanding various facets of intimate partner violence in the queer community?
Thank you very much. It's a very powerful question, and it's a very important question. I don't think when you talk about gender and gender binary, I think the queer community often goes beyond the binary, and does that mean that we are beyond the binary? No, the binary still impacts us as well, especially in terms of relationships with one another, with other members of the community, with other members, with your partners. So yeah, I think there is an important aspect here, central to this as well. So we cannot say that this is only a heteronormative issue or an issue that impacts people in the binary. We're affected by it as well, and I think that's why it then becomes integral to us that this struggle of intimate partner violence is not just an LGBT, it's not just a heteronormative struggle or a heterosexual struggle, but it's a struggle for all of us as well. So I think this plays out. Let's look at queer relationships or same gender relationships between the two people that identify as men. And in those relationships, you will see there could be a strong power imbalance as well, and how certain other intersections of identities can play into it. Let's say race, class, caste, income, social origin, or nationality. These can also have a strong impact onto the aspect of violence as well. So I don't think it's something that is, we're not beyond that. It does play out, and I think there's language now that's, well, not imagined, but it's always been there. It's talking about not heteronormativity, homonormativity, which still upholds elements of heteronormativity and patriarchy and hegemonic and misogyny. So, hegemonic masculinity. So, you still have a culture, especially within gay communities. Going from my own personal experience, when I came out, we often used to talk about gay alpha types and straight acting or passing and stealthing. That there was language around that. And in fact, what we were doing as a community was reinforcing the models of femme shaming, right? So that there was a lot of that. So you didn't pass as gay, you passed as straight. You were straight acting, masculine, alpha type, and not just in terms of psychological, sociology. That reinforces certain economic and political models as well. That plays into those roles of who is the leader and who do we respect the most. So I think there's a lot of deconstruction to be done around that. And then it also plays out into other spaces within the LGBTI community. And we can't look at the LGBTI community as one. What's the word? I forget the word now. My memory slipped me. We're not all the same.
It's not an umbrella, an overarching term, essentially. So you have to sort of break it down.
Yeah. Well, and we're not just not all gay people are the same. Not all LGBTQ+ people are the same, and we have different experiences. And I think one of the key things that one of my board members who often talks about is not we're not a community, we're communities of different people. So we need to be looked at different lenses. So that's very important. And experiences of lesbian women, of bisexual women, of trans women, of queer women is very different to that of gay men. And then you have a lot of even shaming within communities as well. In spaces I came out in, I was socializing, and you'd hear a lot of shaming of powerful women, and of powerful lesbian. The term butch was there. The term dyke was there, and yes, people identify it as butch dyke, but how it gets turned into a pejorative as well is something that is of concern. And then that's, I think, very, very key. I think one of the key things in the queer community as well here is that how much intimate having, and I think this is something that even comes before being even out in the queer community, not being validated and not having that validation whilst growing up and coming out, this fear of being LGBTQ+, then puts you at risk of seeking that validation amongst your peers, right? Okay. So then automatically you're going to engage in behaviors which will put you at even further risk, because you need to be validated, right? Your parts of you, and therefore you will engage in behaviors that are risky, that are detrimental to your health and psychological well-being, and then it also can come into a sort of subordinate role. And I think it even happens in queer communities of color as well. Let's take, this whole idea of being elders in the community. You look up to your elders. Even that happens in the queer communities, right? And then you have, and I'm going to say this, I'm not going to get attacked for it, but you have these communities of akadas, gharanas, in the trans community. The trans mother is the one to be respected. But what about if she's being abusive? She's holding the status of the power, and that is actually abusing other trans people. And we see cases of that in India. We see cases in other parts of the world as well. So I think, intimate partner violence or interpersonal violence is not something that just impacts LGBTIQ. It's not just something that impacts is someone working in the heterosexual community, but we need to, I think, when we understand it I think one of the key aspects of understanding better symbolic violence in the heterosexual world is to actually dissect the symbolic violence happening in the LGBTIQ plus communities as well. I think you can really get down to what's actually happening and where is this coming from, and then we can start to layer away. So that that would give us a better ground and understanding of what's actually happening in other parts and in other communities as well. Not to say one leads to the other or the other leads to one. We don't know what the source is ultimately questioning power, I think, and how we give power, how we present power. And I like this. I think I like the word ram. I don't. When you explained it earlier, professionally, was yes. We need better self-reflection in the conversations we're having. We need to be allowed to stop and think and self-reflect, and by behaving in a correct way as well. So I think, in this sense, we need to stop and have those conversations in our communities as well. And I don't think there's enough of that. We are talking about violence, but on the other side of the spectrum, physical violence towards LGBTQ people. Only now there's starting to have a lot of conversations in LGBTIQ plus spaces on digital-based violence. I think someone was talking about their interest in digital spaces, and it exists. On social apps we see it, such as Grindr, Tinder, Scruff. You'll see violence being manifested in terms of and being hidden behind. Well, this is a preference. No femmes, no fags, no, no femmes, no fags, what have I seen as well? No vice queens, no curry queens. All of those kinds of types of violence being projected out in spaces, and then you're also hidden behind a profile like you don't know. And I think people have a lot to say about that as well. I think there's a lot to be discussed, and I think those conversations are beginning to happen. And how you see the psychological impacts on that on the person who's receiving it as well.
I have a question here, Nanoo, and I'm really curious. You're talking about intersections of identity. The fact that we are actually complex people with multiple identities. I'm curious about your South Asian heritage as well, and about your personal journey, and about how identities here essentially intersected to kind of chart out your journey and your personal experiences. If you could just share a little bit of that with us.
Oh, wow. Okay. So, for me, I've always struggled with my identity. And growing up, I grew up in a multicultural environment in the UK, in Birmingham. For those who know, Birmingham is a very vibrant multicultural city. And we moved to Leicester, which is even more diverse than Birmingham, I can say, in the late 80s. So my first experiences of life was, trying to fit in, and I've always struggled in fitting in, and I think I've constantly had that struggle, up until recently, and I think it's thanks to the work I've done around UN growth. It's been cathartic, I have to say. So looking back, my first experiences were of racism, in particular of classism, not having the right, racism, and especially as a Sikh, as what people always say, as a Sardar, having a little, goodie on my head, and going to school and being mocked at, and not even. It's not that you don't just fit in as a person of color. You don't also fit in as a person of color because of your faith, right? So those are the sort of challenges I had in terms of race. But there was something more to playing at the back of my mind as well. I always had conversations. Was always told, not so much by my family, but distant and extended family or friends of the family. They were so flippant, as if I'd given them permission to make these comments. I should have been the girl, and my sister should have been the boy. So not only insulting me at the same time, but also my sister, and then myself, and also shaming me, and then shaming many women of our community as if being femme is something wrong. And it was I always sort of I had to feel that I had to upplay my masculinity. I had to take on this sort of actual roles. And I think when I started to realize about my sexual orientation, I felt that I had to even do it even more because I need to hide up that femness also means queerness, or gay, and therefore you can give yourself out. And both communities living in the UK, and think that it's fine being gay in the UK. Well, no, you're living in a diaspora community, and that also played on my mind heavily because I just did not know whether I was British or I was Indian. I wasn't white enough for my British friends, and I was not brown enough for my brown my Indian friends or brown friends. It was just a constant struggle, and I still even recall. So in your brown, in your white communities, well, you're a foreigner. You go home to visit your family. You go to India to visit your families in India. Well, you're still a foreigner there. So where do you actually belong? And you hear things in your extended families in India as well. When you go to visit your cousins or other parts of India, like, no, you're not Indian. You don't. This is not yours. You belong somewhere else. And so, well, you go to the UK, where do you belong there? So there's been constantly the struggle between where am I, who am I, what do I belong to? And it's, I never felt that I belonged. And I always had to sort of play up to this identity of, or this facade of trying to be something that I'm not. So taking on this masculinity role, taking on extra brownness, taking on extra whiteness when I needed to, playing to that, playing to extra sort of middle class behaviours when I needed to hide up my working class roots. So there's been that struggle, and I think it wasn't until I came to Geneva and I thought I could be a bit more free, and embarked on my career in the UN. And I was told, well, within a few months, if you want to stay in the UN, you want a career here in the ILO, don't come out. It's not safe for you. So this pushed me further back in the closet. And in the working space, in my professional life, I wasn't out. In my personal life, I was. But even then, I struggled as well. I mean, I want to talk about this as well. Being out in being a person of color, coming out in white spaces or European spaces, very, very different. And the violence as well, the symbolic violence that you have and you experience there. But we'll come to that in a bit. So being out, coming in, I came out, had partners, and my experience there with my partner, with one particular partner was, you clearly you have an issue with being queer and being gay. I identified as gay at that point, and I went, no, I'm fine, of course, I'm Punjabi, I'm a man, I'm fine with this, and it wasn't until I finally realised that actually, no, I'm not okay with it. And I'm actually not okay with this when I started to seek out help. I started going to counselling, and that helped me sort of get to this journey where I was like, okay, this is who I am, and it's time to accept every single part of me. And I thought that the journey had finished. I was like, okay, I'm out, fine, I'm gay, yeah, happy, fantastic. No, that was only the start. Because even though, and I started work volunteer for UN Grove, and I realised that there was a whole community for us, became a board member in 2014, and doing more advocacy work around that kind of spaces, and that gave me the opportunity to learn about myself and unpick all those sort of toxic behaviours and realise actually, hang on, this is what happened to me, this is what happened to me, this is what happened to me. Because at the time you think that's normal, right? You don't have any idea of it. We only know when it's not normal, when it's on the extreme end. On the day-to-day end, we don't know. We accept it on a daily basis, and as if it's you. Now, let me give you an example. Even though I was out in my personal circle, I wasn't out to my family and close family, and there was this whole perception that you had to be out. 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 And now I look back at that and how it created this sort of hierarchy between me and some of my friends who were already out, and it created this sort of distance. It made me feel inferior to them because they were better than me because they were out. And this is something that we also have to be very, very careful in the LGBTI community as well. Just because you're out doesn't mean you're better than those who are not out. In fact, you know what? those voices that are living in the shadows are equally as important, if not more important, because they need to be more represented, right? So it's very, very important that we understand that that this pressure to be out is not for everyone, and it's a very sort of and it's also it's a very Western construct of being out. How do we talk about it? Sort of, I think some Tunisian and Egyptian activists, LGBTQIA activists, came out with the coin word coming in, and because coming out, what it does is I give you power to validate me. Here I am. I'm queer. I've come out to you. Now you have to accept me. Well, hang on. No, actually, I'm going to reverse that power. I'm going to allow you into my space, and I'm going to tell you, and I'm not seeking your validation, so you're coming in to my space. And that's very, very important. That's number one. So how do we talk about coming in? And this is, this is not me making up. This is what I've learned across my journey. So I think, I've been very lucky to do that. Number two, what in our cultures, how do we find that language? In Punjabi, the word gay or queer does not exist. How do I say that? And even the attempts do not really capture the essence of that, of how you identify as well. So that's been my journey so far, and I think I'm still learning, and that's why I'm working with platforms like We Create Space, going into Gabor Mate, sort of, positive self-inquiry, opening myself up to being vulnerable and being challenged, and understanding, okay, where am I comfortable with, and just working with my shadow self. I think that's also very, very important. Having those conversations, and very intimate conversations with your partner about intimacy. What are you comfortable with? What are you not comfortable with as well? I think that's very, very important. And for example, it's very, for me, my partner's always saying, if you want to marry me, you have to get down on me. And I'm like, hang on, no, that's not going to work. I'm not going to get down on you. We're going to do it. We're going to do it together. There's going to be, I think, that for me is very, very comfortable. Also because of we're an interracial couple as well. We have to put that part. We have to look at those dynamics too. So I think it's very important there. But yeah, I don't know if I've gone on too much, but.
Not at all, Nanoo. Thank you so much for walking us through so many such personal experiences of yours. Another thing, which strikes me as you talked about it, was something I read some time back about something called a minority stress. So, they talk about how stress itself is not something which can be generalized. When any minority faces any sort of stress, expressing that stress becomes all the more difficult, because the kind of considerations and the construct surrounding that expression of stress has to be tuned according to how, the construct in which the minority is operating. If I may take an example, and with your permission, I would like to say something like, even something like intimate partner violence, due to its nature of being latent, due to its nature of being just beneath the surface, talking about IPV becomes all the more difficult, because most of the times it's said to be a matter of a very subjective review, whereas it is not. That's what we're trying to understand, how we can fit in IPV and other forms of psycho-emotional abuse into a jargon, into a pattern, which can be very clearly understood. But when it comes to the queer community, do you feel that minority stress operates at different levels? Is it even more difficult to talk about psycho-emotional abuse in same-gender relationships, primarily because of the fact that somewhere it's considered to be a same-gender relationship? It's considered to be a choice rather than a natural progression. That's that. I'm just trying to talk through as to, is that true in talking about psycho-emotional abuse as well?
Wow, that's a very big question. A very important question. I think, is it, so what you're asking is, do we still experience psycho-emotional violence, and do we still talk about it?
No, so are the expressions also subject to any form of a minority stress? The lack of expressions due to the fact that it's difficult to understand and make people understand the kind of abuse you're going through?
I think yes and no. I think because on one side we're talking about psychosocial abuse in terms of being queer in itself and validation, acceptance. So there's that one. You've got that added layer, right? You've got that added sort of layer to discuss. So validation from external, from those outside the LGBTQI community and acceptance. So that psychosocial abuse comes in as well. So there's that, and then you've got to talk about what is happening internally as well, and that becomes a little bit difficult. That becomes very, very difficult as well, and also in terms of healthcare as well. And so I'm always thinking about, well, what's the solution to this? Finding spaces for LGBTIQ people to talk about psychosocial violence externally is an issue in itself, and finding good healthcare practitioners to address that. There's some great people out there doing some work as well. I forget his name, a Canadian psychologist. I did talk to him, he's really good. So he talks about, that, but then also finding the right person to also understand what's happening within the community as well is specifically difficult, and getting someone to understand it as well, because it's laced in that patriarchy, the misogyny, the toxic masculinities and racism. It's all got undertones of that. So it has been difficult. But what's happening now is those conversations are beginning to happen in groups, in community groups as well. When we get together in social events or talking to one another, these conversations are happening now. I mean, this is the start. This is part of that conversation. So I wouldn't say it's not happening at all. But it needs to happen more often as well. And we need to discuss it as well. Talking about intimate partner violence in queer communities as well, and creating those spaces for that dialogue to happen. And so, thank you to Gurchaten for doing this. Because there is that sort of that taboo around the shame around of violence, not just of violence itself, but also then this double victimization. You're this poor queer person, but also this poor queer person who's experiencing violence or psychosocial violence from their partner as well. So I think that becomes a challenge. That conversation is beginning to happen. But I think what the challenge is then is in terms of making people understand it also, especially if you're in communities especially people like ourselves as well. You're sitting on many intersectional identities as a person of color, as a person of faith. How do you seek that support, and how do you identify it as well? Because you're a community within a community within a community within a community. So it's not just minority stress; it's minority to the power of 4 stress. Yeah, I'm not going to quote that. It's minority to the power of 4. So yeah, I think you have those extra layers, and you need to be able to express that not only to your partners but to other people as well, and finding that sort of comfortable space in to do that, but also finding that empowerment to do that as well. Also admitting to yourself. I mean, let me go back to my own experience. I went around telling myself I'm fine. I don't need to speak to a psychologist or a counselor about being gay. I'm a man. I can deal with this. Even that, I think that conversations we have with ourselves, it starts with that as well. Recognizing actually, maybe I do. Now I'm the biggest advocate. Not the biggest, but I would like to say I'm a big advocate for mental health. I think everyone, needs to seek support, needs to talk to someone. Going to therapy is not a bad thing. Having a counselor is not a bad thing. It's good to talk to health professionals, good health professionals.
Sure.
cultured and aware health professionals, because there's some health professionals out there which have got big questions. So, did that answer your question?
It did.
Yeah. Definitely. I find that interesting. You're talking about, of course, mental health, and there's a lot of focus on mental health, and rightly so. But let's say if we want to talk about community healing, so there's the concept of the Sangha in Sikhism. If you could tell us a little bit about how, community healing can also sort of help us go through these experiences of struggle, of kind of coming to a realization, a gradual sort of an acceptance, and where the community could maybe step in and also in a way kind of help the person coping through this sort of a crisis event. So usually transformation doesn't really happen in a single moment. So it's something that takes place over a lot of time. So there's like a process through which you essentially go through. So your story of being in space which made you feel vulnerable, to your story to becoming this celebratory figure, the voice of the LGBTIQ community. That's the transition that we're really interested in. What made that transition happen? Where you are in fact one of the leading voices and people actually stop to listen to you. So what made that happen? What changed it for you? That's something that all of us are really curious about.
Oh, wow. I think, so I'll take the first question, the first part of that question, which is about what brought me to where I am today. And I think in 2013, after stepping out of therapy and coming out at workplace, I went, well, hang on, no one else should go through what I went through. And how can I support other people? Because, back in the day, there was this whole need to reach out to community, and you couldn't reach out without exposing yourself or putting yourself at risk in certain spaces. And before the days of the internet, and I'm not going to say how old. Well, yes, I'm not old. And when the internet came out, I think some of the when the web started creating, coming together, and you started searching, for putting in, I remember some of my good first searches were looking for, LGBT Sikhs or gay Sikh and Sikhism, and so the first thing was that trying to look for your Sangha. And I just couldn't find my community. I was like, what does it say? Number two, because all I'm hearing is like bad. You can't. This is wrong. And that consequently pushed me away from my faith. I was like, okay, even though I was, in expressing I was a Sikh, but deep down I think it pushed me away from Sikhi. I think looking for my Sangha was really, really difficult, and finding that space. But the first thing was, so going back to that question was, why did I do it? Because I wanted to make sure that I didn't have those role models. I couldn't find those. I couldn't see who those people are. And the role models I had, actually, now looking back, I came out in a white gay man's community, and I'm like, oh my God, some of that behavior was so toxic, so femphobic, so fatphobic, so culturally unaware, so racist, so alpha and patriarchal. And this is back in 2013-14 when I just stepped into UN Globe, and it's working for UN Globe has allowed me to go, and take those layers off of liberation, really sort of reconnect with who I am and what my values are, and embrace every single part of me, and heal and work with that hurt. So trying to be that role model for within our queer communities as well. I think that's what's brought me here, and to share. Also, I have to say I've been doing this for, sharing my story and being on various platforms since 15, 16 now, for quite a few years, and I found it such a cathartic and healing process that I can come and stand in front of you all and share and be vulnerable and allowed to be vulnerable. And I think that's the good thing about community healing, is that you're going to be in a safe space. It sounds a bit woohoo and a bit fuzzy, okay? And I can hear the executive director of Recreate Space going, Nanoo, don't do woohoo. It is woohoo. When you're doing that, group catch sort of thing, you're going to be caught and supported, or you just sharing. And I think the good thing about Recreate Space is that a couple of years ago when I sort of learnt about them, first invited to the workshop, was to be able to be in that community space and talk and heal and sort of vent that anger as well. Being in a part of the UN Globe board as well, I've got amazing board members that I've worked with in the previous board and the current one that you get it, that work with, that are there in those spaces where they're doing community healing and activism at the same time, and advocacy as well. So, we have to look at our understanding of healing and community healing is not just a me sharing process, it's a me listening process, it's a me engaging process as well, because by doing, and this is me going back to my Sikhi, by doing what we call seva in my Sangat, gives me healing. It allows me to be vulnerable, it allows me to learn, it allows me to share, it allows me to grow. So I think community healing has got a big part to play in this as well. But you have to find the right community as well. We have to also recognize that as a community. Are we creating safe spaces? And that's key as well, And are we able to call it out and then call it back in as well? Because you said this, you got it wrong, you were transphobic, or you were homophobic. Can we bring in but we need to keep that person back in, because we need to keep that person engaged and part of that community as well. Because otherwise you're adding more violence in that conversation. So how do we create dialogue and spaces in our communities where we can do that as well? So it's not just about, yes, community healing is very important, and yes, it's helped me along my journey, sharing, learning, etc. But it has to be in a way that the community dynamic or the models of community have to be done in a way that is safe for everyone as well. We have to realise power structures within community spaces too, as well. So yeah, I think collective healing is important as much as it is individual healing with yourself. But it's not easy. Not everyone can do it, because you're coming into spaces as well. I mean, with the first company into a Recreate space, or even sharing now, I was scared, absolutely petrified. So that oh my god, what is everyone going to say? And I had to. The first time I did it, I was giving a testimony in a UN space. So a room full of 30 people, 20 people, and sharing my story about being LGBTQI+ with all of them. And I'm like, and I know some of these are my colleagues in the room. So, you kind of have to put yourself in that space. And I think there's another thing is that when you do it, you have to sort of recognize the emotional and physical and mental impact that can happen on you, and the rest you need to recover from that, because you're giving something of yourself, right? And you're giving something of that energy, you're sharing it, and afterwards you're like, need some downtime. I think that's also, for those who are going to be doing this work, recognize that you also need to disconnect and put some healing as well, because to work in the community, to be healing the community, you also need to have time for yourself and healing in your own spaces.
So it's also sort of a structural catharsis, if you may, not just an emotional catharsis for that matter.
Yeah, very much so. Yeah, very, very much so. It's a structural catharsis, because often people reach out to you and they've got this XY issue or that issue, especially in UN Globe. I've got this experienced discrimination, can't get a visa from Ohana, or my parental leave is I need this thing, and they're like, well, what would you like to do? And I'm like, I just want someone to listen. I don't want you to do anything. I just needed to share with someone who actually understand what I'm going through. And that's most of our, in some cases, yeah, they want you to do advocacy, write letters, etc. But in most cases, it's like, no, I don't want anything done. I just needed to share with someone with what I'm going through, because 10 times out of 10, nine times out of 10, they don't have that person to talk to who's going through the same, in that way, in that specific environment.
Okay. Do we have questions from the audience? Because in case we don't, I have another one. So I guess we can just take some time out, Katyayani, and we can ask our people here with us. Friends, do we have any questions? Yes, Diksha, you have one. Go ahead. Yes. Hi, Diksha, you're not audible. So sorry. No. All right, maybe you could just put it on the chat box. We'll read it out. Yeah.
Am I not audible? I am. Perfect. So I wanted to say it because it's been an overwhelming journey in this conversation while I'm listening to you, because I also am a queer person, and I feel like, the stages that you probably gone through, I'm still in them, going through them. This sense of duality, and the fact that because of COVID, we've just been in spaces where, we've been tied back into homes. Now I really love my family. I'm also very spiritual, but then I'm also queer. So my religion doesn't permit me to be queer. And then, there's so many complexities to just being what you are. And I actually ended up crying while you were talking about your journey, because I know that when somebody just talks about their journey, it's so easy. You're just saying stuff, but it's not that easy. It's not that easy when you're going through all of those things. So, I mean, when you talk about community healing and when you talk about finding the right community, all of these things hit home. And so I'm very, very glad that we're having these conversations here right now. Apart from that, the things that we talk about intimate partner violence, and there's one thing that I don't know if it could just strike some conversation probably, and that is that, there's so much there's so much attachment of responsibility when we're talking about intimate partner violence, because, and when I say responsibility, it means like if I go and tell you about something that I've been going through, somebody would just stand up and say, but didn't you choose to be in a relationship with this person? Wasn't this your choice? And then how actively or dormantly, and for what reasons am I constantly choosing to be in such relationships which are toxic with people? It's just something that it's a very difficult space to tread in, because then you can't explain to people, and then you also can't explain things to yourself. So this is one thing that I could think of, if I'm able to make sense. And apart from that, there's another thing, and that is about you talked about therapy, about seeking therapy in the process of understanding your sexual orientation. And while I'm seeking therapy right now, I think therapy is a privilege, and not just like in terms of if you can afford or not afford therapy, but also in terms of the kind of the emotional capacity that it requires. So stay in a family which is never going to understand that what I have gone through after therapy, probably what are the emotions. Also being a queer person, what are the problems that I'm facing? So I can never communicate that. So where do I go after therapy? How do I feel how do I negotiate after therapy? So I mean, that is one bit of why I think therapy, even just being at therapy is privileged. But also I think apart from that, the fact that the person that I'm seeking therapy from is another friend that I met. Like, not a friend, he's obviously older to me, but he's not an LGBTQ person. So essentially, what I'm trying to ask is, did you ever? Because I sometimes do feel the need for him to understand what exactly am I feeling as a queer person, and I'm not able to explain it to him because he is not a queer person. So what do you think? What is your take on this? Do you think that people who are from the community, queer community, exploring, understanding, maybe they end up not being, etc., etc., should one actually go to a LGBTQI plus therapist, somebody who belongs to the community. Because there are a lot of people who say that we are LGBTQ friendly, or like, we are okay with people being, or I don't know, there's a lot of stuff in psychiatry. So what is your experience, and how would you like to comment on that probably? Thank you so much.
No, thank you. I'll work backwards on this. So yeah, I think therapy is a privilege, and thank you for saying that, and I acknowledge that. I was in a position to access therapy, and I had that privilege to do so. And not everyone does. So thank you very much for acknowledging that. I think that's a very powerful point to note. Not everyone has that. And I was very privileged to have a therapist who was from the community as well. That was number two. Where I wasn't privileged was that the therapist didn't understand my cultural background, having living in diaspora communities, living in multicultural backgrounds as well. So that was a bit of a challenge, and having to sort of explain that, this, that, the other. But she was really, really good. And I mean, we get kind of emotional because now when I go to pride rallies or go to events and I'm speaking, and often she's there and she's just looking at me, and I'm, there's a bit of a tear of my eye because I'm like, you as a woman, as a psychologist, lesbian, have brought me and lifted me to this space. So it gets kind of emotional for me in that sense. And we have to acknowledge the immense role that women and femmes play in our community in lifting us up. So big shout out to there, definitely. I think having someone who is LGBTIQ plus is a plus, is an add-on. Okay, is great. And having someone from the culture as well. However, from my experience, sometimes I have people reaching out to me in my UN Globe capacity, seeking mental health support from within the UN system, but making sure it's not from the same country because they're scared that that person is going to perpetuate further stereotypes, and then don't want a person from this culture, this community, because they're scared of having those. There's a phobia, or I wouldn't say phobia. There's a fear of misunderstanding, or even that information. Not even trusting the psychologist to say, or the counsellor to then pass on that information to members of their community. So number one. Then so that's my response there. And generally, going back to your privilege question around, it's not just financial; it's also emotional. You have to be ready to get to there. I wasn't ready for many years. I thought I was fine, and yeah, I had to get myself there. I think the other part is now, and that's why community healing and community groups are so important. That's why, perhaps in brown spaces, you may want to start looking at a subgroup working specifically with queer spaces and creating queer spaces within for queer members. So that could be important, and that's very, very. That's where if you can't have access to that community space, those one-on-one part, it's very important. So yeah, I think for me it is a big privilege, and I recognise that's a big opportunity that I have. What else? There was a first part of your question. I think I've completely missed it. Did I answer everything? Or was yeah?
Yeah, thank you so much.
Nanoo, we have a question from a YouTube viewer, Tony, with pronouns they, them. So what are your thoughts on queer, non-binary people living in abusive homes and having to play multiple roles in their life and repressing aspects of themselves in order to prioritize survival?
Yeah.
Yes, that's Tony's question.
That's a big question. What are my thoughts on this?
Yes.
This is, I think, when it comes to this question, yes, and this is why community spaces are important, because during COVID we're locked in, and which I think you pointed. If I can come to you, you pointed on this about being in family spaces, especially in COVID times, where often many of us, especially in those in parts of the world, in global south countries, or not even in the South, anywhere, we could be located in a situation and tied into homes or settings where you cannot be yourself, where homophobia and biphobia and transphobia is rife in those settings. So, and it is an issue of survival. And I think in response to what has happened during COVID, there was an immediate response to this. Like, okay, there are going to be people that are going to be in settings that are in settings where they're in household settings or family settings where there's going to be homophobia and biphobia, and they're going to be, in particular for trans and non-binary people, going through that is being forced to live and express themselves in ways that it just doesn't fit with them is violence in itself, and that's why I think online groups, online support is very, very critical, and then providing the necessary tools for that, which certain platforms have already been doing, I think. Providing opportunities for them to then sort of leave and come in and out of that, come in and out of those settings and those situations, i.e., having to go for a walk, go to a centre where they can see friends. But that's not always possible, especially if it's a complete zero lockdown. You're not even allowed to leave your house. So building that community support is really, really key, and then also then reaching out to people that may be in that situation as well. Are you okay? Do you need to speak to someone? What's going on? I think that's very, very critical there. So yeah, it's of key concern, and I think as we come out of lockdown, we all have to be ready and anticipate the work that needs to be done to do that healing, not just from COVID, but from those situations that COVID put us in as well, and put many of our siblings through. So, I think, as much as there's going to be a sigh of relief after, post-COVID, and we're talking about that already, but I'm like, okay, no, the work, it hasn't stopped, but, we've got to, it's pushed us back further as well in some regards. And at the same time, it's magnified inequalities in most ways as well. We've seen what's happened. So how are we getting ready as well for that? Especially we've seen a rise in domestic violence during COVID because of lockdown. But then I'm sure we've seen a rise in intimate partner violence as well, and symbolic violence going up too. We've seen the burden of duties of care increase on women. So how are we going to get ready for this when we're coming out on the other side of this? I think we start need to preparing ourselves for that next part. So and then going back to that question around trans and non-binary people, I think there's an extra layer there as well that goes into gender identity and gender expression, where it's just it's violence as well, forcing someone to live in a situation. But what can we then do is that we need more shelters and more protection, provisions of services as well, and that's not always accessible. And that's why I think this space is critical then. So and I hope that answers the question.
It does. Thanks, Nanoo. And such a powerful thought, denial of identity in itself is a form of violence. And I think, that leaves us with a very powerful thought. Do we have any more questions from our other members?
There's a point that I wanted to make, I forgot to make it. I wanted to make it about, the very first question was around gender and gender identity and how it impacts about intimate partner violence or interpersonal violence and the LGBTI community, and why we need to talk about gender spectrum. And I think that, in our initial conversations with Gurchaten and Pradashini, we discussed this. We talked about, let's look at the data in India. The data in India recently came out. We talk about sexual behavior within same-sex, same-gender couples, two men. And in India, there was some data from Grindr, we all know the app, that came out, and it found out, where the most, and I think this data in itself was this. What is it? Why are we asking that question? So it's not, oh, we need to ask this question, but why are we asking that question anyway? But this question, that's a different conversation. But the data came out, where in the world has got the most tops, where it has got the most bottoms, where it's got the most firsts. So top, if those who are a favourite of the community, i.e. those who are top, top is often associated with masculinity, bottom is often associated with femininity. And then there's verse, tops, verse, bottoms, all of those types within the gay men or LGBTQ men's community. They found that men in India, found the data presented in India was that there were more tops in India. And I think what that then shows, and I was like, hang on, more tops in India. I'm like, well, that's interesting. Does that mean that, is there an issue in men about subordination in India? That being a bottom, we often talk about bottom shaming in the queer community. There is so much bottom shaming, and actually it's not just bottom shaming, it's actually intrinsically linked to femme shaming. Because to be penetrated is to give up power. And I'm like, well, hang on, this is what is going on in India. Is there bottom shaming or there's around this in India that to bottom is to be feminine, therefore subordination as well? Is this what's playing out in sexual behavior in India and online as well? And I think that's an interesting, whoever's looking into psychology, sociology, or doing a research on men's sexual behavior in spaces in India, and bottoming versus topping. Yeah, that'd be an interesting research to be done. I just want to get to that and how it plays out, how this binary plays out even in intimacy. And because I forgot to mention that point earlier. So that's really, really critical to look at. Do we see it as a form of subordination? I think it's quite powerful, even in such settings.
So even in kink, for instance, Nanoo, I was interested in how gender, plays a role in kink, especially in kink cultures and subcultures, especially when it's related to the idea of dominance.
I think where does the issue between violence in kink and in BDSM communities and fetishization? So when I first stepped out in the queer community and the dating apps were there was a lot. Even before the apps started, I was so fetishized. There was fetishization on the other extreme was like, oh, you don't fit to our Western beauty standards, you're not white, you're not blonde, you're not blue-eyed, and that made me even hate myself even more, because I was like, I do not fit into Western beauty standards. Then on the other extreme, it was like, ooh, wow, exotic. What's under your turban? Can you show me your hair? This sort of, this, he's Indian, this Sikh warrior kind of, okay. Here we go. So you get to the other side of that as well. And then, so at one point, is that fetishization or is it a form of violence because it's reinforcing racial stereotypes, it's exoticization. There's a part there. Then there's a whole question around between, in the queer community as well, and there's a big debate going on between different generations of the queer community as well. You've got the boomers versus Gen X, millennials, Gen Z, talking about whether kink should actually be presented and be present in pride parades as well. There's a lot of conversation around that, and I think, at what point does a fetish then turn into a power relationship, and how do we discuss that power relationship as well? Let's just talk about basic BDSM between the dominant and their subordinate. What point does it go into violence? And even in the BDSM and in the dom and in the kink community that doing work on BDSM and have mistresses or have masters, there are clear rules around power. There are clear rules around this play. At any one point, it can then, and if it's not done in a healthy way, in a respectful way, and then at what point then it does become violence. And I think there's a lot to be discussed around this, because it's not to say what kink is bad or fetishization is bad. It's at one point does it start to creep into the intimate partner, into the interpersonal violence part. And I think that I think the good thing about there's some great podcasts out there like What's the Safe Word that talk about this and talking about BDSM and about kink and fetishes and how do we explore that in a healthy way as well. But we also then have to. But the problem, especially, is I'm talking about my experiences from a diaspora perspective. Is that we don't always have the environments to be able to do that because there's so much shame around sex and intimacy. So we're not even there yet when we talk about kink. But how can we talk about kink and fetishes as well in a safe and healthy way, because there's so much shame around sex. And that doesn't allow us to do that. And therefore, it reinforces the power, because you got that silencing, and then it reinforces the idea of that, this is taboo, and that those voices get pushed back into become more more silence, and therefore allows for unsafe behaviours to be engaged. So those who are dominating it's that patriarchy happening again, even when it's in silence as well, because we can't talk about sex because it's shameful, and it's because why is it shameful? Because it allows me to go and have and carry out abusive behaviours. So, even what I'm trying to say is that even the conversations that we were trying to have are being dominated by abusers as well. So that's something to watch out for. But yeah, I think we need to start having those conversations in a healthy way.
Absolutely, Nanoo. Thank you so much for sharing such a wide spectrum of thoughts with us. And I think if there are no more questions, and I may be permitted to ask one last thing, which I wanted to ask you, is that how do we start moving towards a solution? There are no solutions to such latent violence as yet. Probably there cannot even be a lot of solutions, but how do we move on to healing? Probably the first step is communicating, but here on, how does one start healing? How do we move on to community healing? How do we better partners to our friends who are in need of healing at that time? And any solution which you feel might be apt to work on.
I think we've already started. You've already started. I think Varam has started. I think that's the first thing. You created this space, and you've allowed people to engage and share. That's another. So that's the key part, and allowing people to be vulnerable and finding those voices that can engage, to have this conversation from our community. I think keep on going. This is essential. These spaces are essential. This conversation is essential. I will be taking this back to my other groups as well, and how do we discuss this? So it's not just saying, we've had this and how do we go away? I think, how do I embed this into my daily behavior and pause? I like that, and pause and think and self-reflect about that. What am I doing? How am I behaving? Am I aware of any power imbalances or privileges that I'm exerting on my partner, my colleagues, etc., etc. So I think we need to take the time to understand this first. What is it? And start to apply it to ourselves. I'm a big advocate. I think the problem with I was discussing this with someone yesterday. Actually, it's like, you point the finger at someone else, there's going to be three pointing back at you. So instead of pointing that finger at someone else, point it at yourself first, and then look at yourself. I think, but you need to have the right tools to do critical and positive self-reflection and working with that shadow self. So before we go out there trying to help other people and understanding this in how it manifests me versus what is someone doing, what is someone doing to me? It's what am I doing to myself? Number one, first question. Number two, what am I and how am I doing it to others? Before, because I think that's where the journey starts, is with yourself. It's not, it's often, we think about what has been done to me. No. What am I doing to myself? And number two, what am I doing to others? And sort of dissecting that, and then trying to go on the next part of that journey when you're able to engage in those dialogues about, well, what part of my behavior is not good. So I think that's the third part, is the individual. Then we have the whole collective part as well. So we have to work on those different levels: the personal, the community, the cities, or the national level, and then the global. But keep this conversation going, because I think there's not enough of this being had. We often, that violence is a spectrum, and when we first spoke, Pradarshini, it was like, yes, this is where some of the origins of violence is here. It's now in interpersonal violence, it is in symbolic violence. This is where it starts, and then it grows and grows and grows. So if you can actually get it here, then you're actually going to prevent other forms as well. So yeah, I think raising more awareness around this is critical. We're only talking. We had the International Convention on Violence and Harassment at Work, and we're talking about violence and harassment in digital spaces as well. So there's a lot of work still ready to be done, and I think building that, there's a lot of academics in this group building that knowledge in this, doing that research, sharing it with people, educating people as well, and empowering it as well, empowering people. That's the key thing too. I think it also means a multi-sectional approach. We still need to work with a lot of people in different spaces, especially in our communities. Faith spaces is critical. Faith spaces are very, very critical for us. Yeah.
I think those are some wonderful takeaways. Katyayani, you could possibly, give a formal vote of thanks. I think right now is a good time, and
Yes.
we'll wind up because we're exceeding the time. Go for it.
There was a question from is it Diksha? Can we take one more?
Diksha,
Can we take a minute and extend this? I'm extremely sorry.
Please go for it. Yes.
All right. So I think I had two more things to say. One about do we need separate spaces for LGBTQI community, because this has been a constant problem in sorts, or so do we really need exclusionary spaces? One is what I wanted to ask, and two is that what do we do with the exhaustion that we feel that comes in when we are doing and when we are fighting, because I'm sure everybody who's working in the social developmental sector has at many points in time faced that kind of exhaustion that we face, because we always know that it's a long journey, and then we don't know about possibly a lot of solutions. When you talk about, especially when you talked about how post COVID there's going to be another struggle that's it's waiting for us to the problems that we're supposed to be dealing with post-COVID and stuff of that sort. So how does one deal with that kind of exhaustion, that I have to heal myself, then also there's a community that I really need to reach out to? How does one deal with that? And also, do we need exclusionary spaces for LGBTQ communities? Thank you so much.
Okay, so I'll go for the second part first. We have the right as individuals to prioritize ourselves and to check out. It's okay to not be okay, number one. Number two, it's okay to check out, as in, sorry, I'm out, I can say no. I need to take myself out, I need to heal. and I'm going to go and ask for help. So number 2, and give yourself permission to ask for help, because often we don't. So much pride as well. Punjabi community is guilty. A Punjabi person guilty of pride. Didn't want to ask for help. Went out and got. So that's very, very important. Ask for help, and it's okay. And we often have this sort of guilt, and we do it to. We're also especially guilty. Is like there's a question I was on the panel earlier this week, and it was like, well, am I activist enough? Am I advocating? Am I a career leader enough? And you're like, well, if that person's not stepping up, do what you can. Do not. We need to stop this comparison as well, because that also is this heteronormative lineage, this heteronormative thinking that's coming in. Comparison is not always good. It's different. Okay, comparing them to what? When we're different. It's different. Okay, you're doing different type of activism to what I'm doing, right? And not everyone wants to be an activist. Not everyone has to. And that's also, I think, when I first started, shaping up the Nanoo, I was writing my fist. I was like, oh God, people are not being activists enough. No, it's okay. Not everyone needs to be an activist. And realizing that's very, very important, because we're putting extra different weight. Because often, more enough, just being who we are is, especially if you're trans and non-binary, in itself is a form of resilience, right? So why do more when you have to, if you can have the capacity to do more, great, and create this. And we have then a duty to make space and create space for that. But you have the right to check out and say, sorry, this is not for me. Okay, and I think we need to stop putting pressure on other people to do that as well. If they're not okay with it, fine. And also, we need to, especially for the leaders in our community, we need to be ready to, those who are on the front line, and I'm sorry for using military language, but those who are on the front line, pushing and pushing and pushing, they need to be propped up or need to be taken off the front line sometimes, and someone else needs to go in front. And consequently, how do we keep this? And it's not to use sort of tactical sort of language here that we use in the military, but we do need to prop those leaders up. We need to support them, but also then say, okay, time out, check out. You need to come back. We need to regroup as well. And cool. Now then, go back to your first question. Do we need I think your question is not about exclusionary LGBTI spaces. I think it's exclusive LGBTI. Exclusionary would mean that they're saying no. And we do need to recognise that at times women, LGBTIQ+ women or Indigenous LGBTIQ+ communities need their own spaces, and we need to recognise that and hold ourselves accountable when we enter those spaces. Do we need exclusive LGBTIQ+ spaces? Are LGBTIQ+ spaces always exclusive? Yes and no. Because certain LGBTIQ+ spaces, I'm going to challenge that by saying there are certain spaces where it's only gay men. And where you walk into an event and you're like, where are the queer women? Where are the trans? Where is everyone? Where is this it? Is this the gay LGBTIQ community where we don't have full representation? So we have exclusion within exclusion already, and how do we break that? And that's really difficult. But then the challenge is, how do we then create? One of the key things that I've realized is it's really difficult to do that, because one of the things in UN Globe in Geneva, what we had to do was create a sub event, or just another event for LGBTIQ+ women, and where it's a space for women. Everyone was welcome, but if you did not identify as a woman, you may be asked to leave because someone may not feel safe. So you also have to recognize that as well. Like if you're going into such spaces, you may not. You may be asked to leave. So you do, when you're doing that, you need to sort of clearly explain that to people as well. I think. Do we need exclusive? I think there's not a yes or no answer to this. It depends when and where. It depends. It really depends. There are times when you need that. You need to come in and go, I need my tribe. But then if you're someone like me, you have different tribes. You know, you roll in different circuits and you have different tribes. And because you need that space to vent, be angry and allowed to be angry, because you know, when you're doing advocacy in my spaces, you can't always do that, and it's like, you know, I need to vent, and I need to go and do it in a space where I can vent, and it's not just exclusion, it's not just exclusively gay, but it's exclusively queer and of color, and I need to do it there. And so yeah, they do help. There's a cathartic part of that, but it depends on what form. You know, if it's for healing, then perhaps it's important. Yeah, I hope that answers your question.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Nanoo. We're so incredibly grateful to you. You know, you took out so much of time. You shared so much with us. You shared your time with us. And most importantly, the trust you reposed in us and our platform and the vision we are carrying forward. I think we'll always be incredibly grateful to you. You're leaving us with very powerful thoughts. And you know, those thoughts will be things we'll be working on for the next few weeks. And definitely we'll be sharing our insights with you. We'll be debating, we'll be talking about it, we'll be discussing, we'll be seeking your guidance, because that's the most precious thing for us in all of these thoughts, because the clarity with which you've shared your thoughts with us, the thoughts you've left us with, I think, you know, they'll be a guiding light for us for the next few days, for sure. And you've also given us a very gentle but firm nudge to keep on communicating. I think, you know, for me, that takeaway is so incredibly precious, because that the power of communication has been reposed in my mind. So I think, you know, we'll be keeping on talking about it, and also we'll be sharing our logo with you very soon. We'll be, to honor our commitment to work on all forms of IPV across the gender spectrum, we'll be changing our logo to represent the rainbow. For the period of time we'll be discussing IPV amongst the queer community. So we'll be sharing that with you as well. Thank you so much, Nanoo. Over to Priya now.
I think there was some very powerful takeaways there. Of course, creating safe spaces, creating spaces where we can be vulnerable, a space for catharsis, the importance of self-reflexivity, and of course, reimagining, you know, the golden rule. It's not just about how we want to be treated, but how the significant other also wants to be treated. And I think I'll just wrap it up. And this is to all our experiencers, survivors in the audience, our viewers. Your stories are real and you're believed. And know that we in Viram stand with you today in health, in support, in pride, and in power. Thank you, Nanoo. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nanoo.
No, thank you. I am truly honoured. I think, you know, please let me know, keep me in touch, and how we can collaborate further. Going forward in other spaces that I work in as well, or I'm part of. I'd be honoured to be part of this. And I think it's a very, very important discussion to be had. So keep on having it. I wish you all the best in this. And thank you very much for inviting me. And I learned so much from you all as well. I was talking to my folks about you yesterday. I'm like, oh my god, you know, this is amazing, you know. And then sort of passing it on to the generations as well. That you know, our elders that have gone, you know, that have often reinforced these models, and it's important that we share with them as well. So yeah, keep on going, keep on going. Thank you.
Certainly.
Thank you.
All right then. Bye-bye.
So much. Oh, you may, if you feel free to share my details with people. You can find me on social media, on Instagram and Facebook and Twitter as well.
Certainly.
Yeah.
And we've recorded this conversation as well, so we'll be circulating.
Okay, perfect.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.